my talk will be a little bit different from the one that was advertised on the handout. In the 1940s, the leading social anthropologist of his generation, Edward Evans Pritchard, as a result of studies in Africa, made... Stand on the cross, sorry. I'm probably not failed to stand on the cross. I cannot stand still. But I'll do my best. He made what he claimed was a systematic distinction between witchcraft and sorcery. He said that in the case of witchcraft he had observed in Northern Africa, the malicious action of witches was the result of an inner mental state. And in contrast, the action of sorcerers was the result of the manipulation of external tools, words or tools. And that, he made that distinction. In the generation that followed, a whole series of anthropologists tried to systematize that distinction and build a sociological comparison between societies or institutions with witchcraft and institutions or societies with sorcery accusations. That continued into the 1960s, people asking, under what social conditions do witchcraft accusations arise? Under what social conditions do sorcery accusations arise? Are there systematic punishments for witches as opposed to sorcerers, etc.? This apparently scientific or well-grounded methodological enterprise fell apart in the 1960s when it was discovered, when people were working on witchcraft and sorcery in medieval Europe, that categorization didn't apply in Europe, as in fact Evans Pritchard had noted might be the case when he originally set up his distinction. The category witchcraft and sorcery collapsed. There is no systematic distinction between them. So what my talk is about today is about whether or not the category race can be really used as the basis for an academic project which will advance scientific understanding as opposed to local, historical and interpretive understanding of the particular struggles in a particular society at a place in time. So I'm an anthropologist. I'm interested in comparative social science, understanding the way humans think in broader terms than just in one place and one time. So my story concerns it's a sad story of a Romani woman, a German Romani woman, a Sinti, as she would now be labelled, called Katharina Rosenbach, who, on the 18th of February 1941, took herself to the Home of People's Health in Frankfurt on Main, where she was attending in order to request a certificate of suitability for marriage. In 1935, all German citizens, all residents of Germany, had been ordered to obtain such certificates of suitability for marriage. There had been such outcry in the following 3 years that order had been abandoned by 1938 because so many ordinary, basically working class and especially rural Germans, including many members of the Nazi Party, had been refused suitability certificates for marriage under that order. In 1939, that order had been reinstated for all Zigeuner, all gypsies. But the problem, of course, was that it's very hard to distinguish Roma or Gypsies from the German population in general. There were no, in many cases, there were no distinguishing physical features, and people's ethnic status wasn't recorded in their papers. So it's not clear entirely why Katharina Rosenbach took herself on that February morning into the Home of People's Health. It may be because she had slightly darker skin and was identified therefore as a gypsy. It may be because of her name. It's a common gypsy name. Most likely it was because she didn't have any papers. She didn't have any birth certificate. She didn't have any official registration. The only piece of paper she had was a scrappy christening certificate from 1914, which said she was born in 1911 in Paris, angeblich, supposedly, and no month and no date. That would be typical for many Romani families, for many Romani people of her generation. And on that basis, the authorities just in the registrar's office might have said, we can't let you marry without a certificate, because they would have thought there was something gypsy-like about this position. Katharina Rosenbach was special because her fiancé was a German. He was in the army. She had opposed her family. She had insisted that she marry a German. She was also special because, or her case was special because her mother-in-law had suggested to her that although she had a 2-year-old child, a 1.5-year-old child at that stage, she should claim to be pregnant when she went to the office and say, it's really urgent that we get married. My husband's fighting at the front. Please help. She was in a hurry also because the systematic persecution of Zigeuner in Germany and in Frankfurt had intensified. Her younger brother had just been killed in the mental institution of Hadamar, where he'd been taken, and they'd received a died of heart attack death certificate, which was typical for the euthanasia campaign, for euthanasia program victims. She was unfortunate because she was doing this in Frankfurt on Main, because in Frankfurt on Main, the highly respected Baron Ottmar Freiherr von Verschoor was the head of state health institutions in the city. He went on to have an illustrious post-war career, including participating in the UNESCO 1948 Conference on Race. He had 66% of the population of Frankfurt registered by the time Katharina Rosenbach turned up. Immediately, the examination for the certificate went wrong. Within 5 minutes, they'd created a family tree on which he had marked that her mother's father was a Zigeuner, a gypsy, and she should come back for further investigation, and marked on the form grave danger of propagation because of the story that she was pregnant. When she came back, she was seen by Hans Graeber, any medics in the room, Graeber's syndrome, a well-known, well-established doctor who had a propensity for giving negative racial evaluations in Frankfurt. He was far more severe, in fact, than his boss, for sure. Graeber said, no question of you being allowed to marry. His problem was, she's pregnant, how can I sterilise her? We don't want a child of mixed race coming into being in our state. There was no law under which he could, no legal way in which he could do that. A refusal of marriage didn't have any further consequences. What he suggested was that they do an IQ test and assess her for feeble-mindedness, congenital feeble-mindedness, under the 1933 law that we've just heard. A tricky procedure, because that 1933 law was written by Weimar medical eugenicists and had no racial clause in it whatsoever. They carried out the IQ test, and unfortunately you can't read it. Anyway, and argued that the IQ test demonstrated that the total genetic worth of this woman was so low that she should not be allowed to propagate. The case went to court. It was thrown out by the judges who met her well-presented child, discovered that she wasn't going to cinema because her fiancé was at the front, and how could you enjoy yourself in such conditions, and said this woman is not feeble-minded. Now, Verschoor, whose face you've seen, was absolutely outraged at this and appealed to Herbert Linden, who was the head of the medical service of the German Reich at the time. Linden wrote back to the judge saying, look, in our state, the 1933 law should be understood to mean that all those unwanted among the German people should be eliminated. The judge threw the case out again, saying this is not a new fact in law. Verschoor appealed once again, came back. The case goes backwards and forwards. But the absolutely crucial point is that what Verschoor does is he appeals to the work of a man called Robert Ritter, who had written a work called Ein Menschenschlag, a human type. And I'm coming towards the end of my time, so I'm going to summarise this very rapidly. Verschoor came from a medical tradition like Eugen Fischer, for whom there were no such things as pure races. The German folk was made up of a mixture of races. These were biologically trained individuals. They knew that mixing of lines, of lineages, in most cases, especially when they were racially close, was beneficial. They were not anti-mixing. In that sense, they didn't believe in pure races. Ritter worked for Heinrich Himmler. Ritter worked within a much clearer Nazi framework for thinking about race in terms of pure races. One of Ritter's jobs was to find pure racial gypsies who might be preserved for some kind of circus after the war, and to identify all those Mischlinge, all those mixed gypsies. And here's, I've drawn out an example, actually more extreme than in the Nuremberg Jewish laws of somebody who ought to be treated as a gypsy Mischlinger. So, for sure, we came from the tradition associated with Alfred Plötz, the founder of German eugenics, middle-class improvement, no racial war, Nordicism, the belief that the Nordic race is superior, rejecting all that as mystical nonsense. Ritter came from this kind of Nazi, almost Streicher-like view of racial mixing. And I'll just give you the chart that he drew up for this woman, Katharina Rosenbach, to show why she was of low genetic worth. What is so striking about this case is that for sure was a leading scientist, probably one of the leading geneticists of his generation. He knew that Ritter's claims were bull. He knew that they had no scientific basis whatsoever. The question is, was he just being a pragmatist? Was he furious that Graeber, who worked for him, had his recommendation rejected by the judge? Was he a bully? Or what did he really believe that in some sense, although Ritter was simply helping him get his case, his sterilisation through, was there some way in which they were talking about the same thing? And it seems to me that most likely what Ritter was thinking was he was thinking in essentialising terms. Thinking that there is something essential about this person that all of us are kind of groping towards defining, and that is what we are targeting. And so it seems to me that the lesson of this story is that if we're to understand racism in a scientific or a social scientific fashion, then we probably have to step outside the categories of race. Races, as we know, don't exist. And racial thought is totally incoherent in the way that for sure and Ritter's work was incoherent in this respect. But it is part of a much broader human tendency to think in terms of essential categories, a tendency, in fact, that we probably all share much more than we like to think. And in that frame, this discussion becomes genuinely interesting to a much broader social science agenda. Thank you very much.